feeling, oh, I'm free. And then about a couple of months later, I was panicking. What am I going to do? What can I do? Oh, it's awful. I think it's that was saying that type of confusion. I mean, it's only now that I feel more or less settled. I think it's because what I'm doing, I'm doing what I want to do, really.
When talking about Joy Division, we must inevitably begin at the end. The suicide of the band's singer, Ian Curtis, casts a long and unavoidable shadow over his group's musical and cultural legacy. Like those of Kurt Cobain, Ian Curtis's lyrics of despair and alienation are lent an almost unbearable weight and significance by the knowledge that their writer later took his own life. No matter what the personal reasons for that fatal act may have been, Joy Division's music and Ian's suicide now seem inseparable, as though they were all part of the same grand artistic statement. Joy Division, however, were very much a group, and not just a vehicle for their lead singer. Peter Hook's bass lines, Bernard Sumner's guitar, and Stephen Morris's drumming are as integral to their sound and appeal as the vocals and lyrics. And 25 years later, Joy Division are more popular than ever. Their influence can be heard in any number of contemporary groups, from Interpol, Editors and Block Party, to two of the biggest rock bands in the world today, U2 and Radiohead, who openly admit Joy Division as a primary inspiration. The band are now considered one of the all-time classic rock groups, alongside the likes of The Doors and the Velvet Underground, as well as a recurring favourite of a generation who weren't even born when Ian Curtis died. The musical landscape has changed utterly since Joy Division's brief lifespan, yet their records now sound more contemporary than ever. The band grew out of punk rock, the musical and cultural phenomenon that swept across Britain in the late 1970s. Punk was a liberating force, a musical manifesto that said you didn't need to be able to play guitar like Jimmy Page or Eric Clapton in order to form a band. Punk's Year Zero gave groups like Joy Division a clean slate on which to reinvent rock music, free of the clichés of the older generation. Integrity and passion were what mattered, staying true to your own vision rather than following the crowd. In that sense, the fact that Joy Division evolved a sound so unlike the punk template that inspired them was testament to their understanding of the movement's central tenet. Bernard Sumner said that punk rock was vital because it rescued music from the crap and made it real again, but bemoaned its limited vocabulary. Punk was only capable of expressing simple feelings of anger and frustration, he said, but sooner or later someone was going to take energy and inspiration from punk and make it express more complex emotions. He was more right than he knew, for in fact Joy Division were the band, and the emotions they expressed have resonated ever since. The story of Joy Division really begins, along with many others, at the Sex Pistols concert at Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall on the 4th of June 1976. Somewhere between 40 and 70 people witnessed this now legendary performance, but almost all of them went away transformed by the experience. Those present included future Buzzcock members Pete Shelley, Howard Devoto and Steve Diggle, local television presenter Tony Wilson, DJ, music booker and general sound obsessive Martin Hannett, a Stooges-loving teenage misfit then working on Salford docks called Mark E. Smith, ginger-haired soul boy Mick Hucknall, a young New York Dolls fan by the name of Stephen Patrick Morrissey, and three Salford schoolmates, Bernard Dickin, Peter Hook and Terry Mason. Among many others, Hook, Dickin and Mason left the show urgently discussing plans to form a punk band of their own. It wasn't so much the music of the Sex Pistols that inspired the two lads, as the London band's very lack of apparent musical ability. Punk rock looked like something that anyone could do, and a right laugh as well. In fact, the Sex Pistols were far more musically proficient than legend would have it, and it was the dreadful PA and sound mix on the night that made them sound as if they couldn't play. What really shocked was the energy and aggression emanating from the stage, the sense that this band were breaking all the rules and redefining exactly what you could get away with. Tony Wilson later recalled sitting staring open-mouthed at the stage as rock and roll was murdered and then reborn before his very eyes. For Bernard, Terry and Peter, the Sex Pistols were the first band that they could really identify with. They were obviously just young kids of roughly their own age and background, not trying to be rock stars, but just going for it with everything they had. The big acts of the day were the likes of David Bowie and Led Zeppelin, who deliberately cultivated a sense of distance between them and their audience, accentuating their self-created mythology and playing the star for all it was worth. So pervasive was this attitude that even most of the small bands coming up imitated it, as though by acting like a star you would automatically become one. The only alternative were the muso-ish pub rock bands, but they equally set themselves above their audience by emphasising their peerless musical proficiency. The Sex Pistols displayed none of this pretentious behaviour. Johnny Rotten would blow his nose on stage, appearing alternately disinterested or like a man possessed as the band thundered chaotically behind him, seemingly uncaring as to whether anyone liked them or not. In fact, they appeared openly to invite antagonism. They also seemed to be having the time of their life. The Sex Pistols seemed like the coolest gang in the country, and one that anyone could join if you just made the necessary leap of faith. Like the Buzzcocks, Morrissey and Marquis Smith, Peter, Bernard and Terry left the concert with one thought in their minds: we can do that too. Bernard Sumner was born on the 4th of January 1956 in Salford, the Lancashire industrial town that has gradually been absorbed into the suburbs of North Manchester. It was an area dominated by factories and canals, old textile mills and modern chemical plants. He lived with his mother and her parents in a small terraced house on Albert Road, with his mother's sister and her daughters only a few doors away. And when his mum remarried, Bernard took on his new stepfather's surname of Dickin. Like many of his generation, Bernard grew up obsessed with the Second World War, which had only ended 10 years before he was born. The effects of the conflict were still obvious all around him, in the damage done to both places and to people. But Bernard had never tired of hearing his older relatives' tales of life during wartime. He was particularly enthralled by his grandfather's collection of mementos and souvenirs, which were kept in the attic. The young Bernard would spend hours rummaging through this treasure trove, the chilling nature of some of the artefacts serving only to make them all the more fascinating. In the mid-60s, however, two things happened to shatter Bernard's poor but carefree existence. When he was 11, his family was moved, along with many others, into one of the new, clean and modern tower blocks that were being erected all around the city centre. Their initial sense of literally going up in the world was soon replaced by awareness that the community had been torn apart, uprooted and destroyed. Bernard had assumed that everyone in the street would be moved into the same tower block, but this was not the case, and an indoor toilet and bathroom was scant compensation for the sense of loss and displacement the move engendered. The second incident was when, shortly after the move, Bernard's stepfather died suddenly. On the verge of adolescence, he felt abandoned, as though everything secure in his childhood had been taken away from him. Subconsciously, he felt a deep sense of anger that never actually left. Despite these traumatic events, Bernard was an intelligent kid who passed his 11+ exam and was so enthralled at Salford Grammar School, where he found himself in the same year as Peter Hook. Born just a few weeks after Bernard on the 13th of February 1956, Peter had a similar northern working-class childhood. On the surface, the shy, slight Sumner couldn't be more different from the burly, aggressive Hook, but the two bonded over their love of music, particularly high-energy American soul and early Jamaican reggae. Elsewhere, their tastes differed. Peter loved the heavy groups like the Groundhogs and Hawkwind, while Bernard considered most rock music to be absurdly macho redneck nonsense. They both left school at 16, with little prospects. Bernard had a definite talent for drawing, but couldn't afford to go to art school. Eventually, he managed to get a job as a tea-boy for the animation company Cosgrove Hall. Peter was offered a choice between becoming a manual labourer or taking on a clerical job at Salford Town Hall. He chose the latter, and life for both of them settled into a familiar routine of work, drinking and chatting up girls at North Salford Youth Club. That was until Terry Mason, who the pair had remained firm friends with since school, insisted that they all go to the Sex Pistols gig. After the show, the trio promptly decided to form a band of their own. Bernard already owned a guitar, so Hooky decided that he would play bass, and the next day went into a city centre music shop with 35 quid to buy one. He had no idea what make he wanted, but at least came away with a model in the colour of his choice. Terry, meanwhile, became the drummer by default. The first practice took place in Bernard's grandparents' living room, where he and Hooky plugged their guitars straight into the record player, as neither of them owned an amplifier. They couldn't play, they sounded dreadful, and the record player was ruined. But they didn't care. Salford's very own punk band was on its way. On the 20th of July, the Sex Pistols played the Lesser Free Trade Hall for a second time. By now, word had spread, and there were twice as many people in the audience as before. Bernard, Peter and Terry went again, along with a lad they'd started to see around town. A tall, odd-looking chap with an icy stare who wore an old green army jacket with hate painted in orange across the back. His name was Ian Curtis. Ian Kevin Curtis was born on the 15th of July 1956 and grew up in the Cheshire village of Herdsfield on the outskirts of Macclesfield. It was an idyllic rural childhood playing out in the fields, woods and streams, and a far cry from the dystopian urban cityscapes that he would later conjure up in his writings. His father was a detective officer in the Transport Police and also an aspiring writer, the author of several unpublished plays. Ian inherited not only his love of literature and his creative drive, but also his tendency towards depression and angry, silent moods. Like Bernard, Ian was uprooted to a new modern council flat around the time he passed the 11+. At Macclesfield's prestigious King's School, Ian was regarded either as a charismatic figure or a potential psychopath by his fellow schoolmates, depending on whether or not they found themselves on the wrong end of his notorious glare. Perhaps surprisingly, he was keen on sports and also did well academically, receiving a special distinction in history and divinity. Ian's main interests, though, were music and drugs. With a select group of rebellious school friends, he drank and smoked heavily from an early age, smoked dope, took amphetamine sulfate, sniffed glue and abused prescription painkillers, often filched from the medicine cabinets of unsuspecting pensioners. The soundtrack to this makeshift chemistry experiment was initially the aggressive art school glam rock of David Bowie and Roxy Music, which in turn had led Ian back to the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed, The Doors, the MC5 and Iggy Pop and the Stooges. Later on, he developed a love for reggae, particularly Bob Marley and Toots and the Maytals. As for his future, he told anyone who would listen two things: that he was going to make it as a singer in the music business and that he was going to die before he was 25. In 1972, Ian met Deborah Woodruff at the local youth club. He was the lanky, awkward lad in his sister's bright pink fake fur jacket, black nail varnish and eyeliner. She was a quiet, mousy girl who liked Motown and the Beatles. Nevertheless, they hit it off, and within 2 years they'd got engaged. They married on August the 23rd, 1975, and bought a small house in Barton Street, Macclesfield. Ian had dropped out of school midway through his A-levels and found a job working at Rare Records in Manchester, which enabled him to keep up with all the latest new releases. He eventually left Rare Records to run his own record store on Butler Lane Antique Market, but this was a resounding failure and he was forced to apply for a steady job in the civil service. After several months working for the Ministry of Defence, he was moved to the Manpower Services Commission in Manchester city centre. Ian still harboured musical ambitions, but apart from travelling down to London for a Jonathan King organised talent contest, he seemed to be taking no practical steps to advance them. As he became aware of the punk phenomenon, however, he knew that this was what he'd been waiting for, and that he had to act fast in order to be a part of it. His own attempts to form a band had come to nothing, and when he answered an ad for the singer that Bernard and Terry had placed in the window of Virgin Records, they decided to join forces. They did know each other already and knew that they liked the same music and could get along. Like Bernard, Ian was fascinated by the Second World War and with Germany and Nazism in particular. He devoured the pulp war novels of the day, as well as the work of more challenging counter-cultural authors such as William Burroughs, J.G. Ballard and Hermann Hesse. Although he could be one of the lads, beneath the surface he was something of an intellectual. He was meant to be writing a novel of his own, and certainly had files full of poetry and song lyrics. He was already part of their social group, so to Bernard, Peter and Terry it seemed natural for Ian to join the band. Ian was determined that the band would make it, and tried hard to make contact in the Manchester music scene. Pete Shelley of the Buzzcocks had come up with the name The Stiff Kittens, and their manager, Richard Boone, suggested Ian use it when he asked for advice regarding his fledgling group. It wasn't the kind of help Ian had in mind, and he hated the name. Nevertheless, Boone advertised the band as such when they played their debut gig, supporting the Buzzcocks at Manchester's Electric Circus venue on May the 29th, 1977. This was in spite of the fact that they had already settled on a name of their own choosing. Warsaw, taken from the instrumental track Warsaw on David Bowie's just-released Low album. By this time, Terry Mason had realised that he wasn't cut out to be a drummer and had carved out a niche for himself as the band's manager instead. A lad called Tony Tabak played drums for Warsaw that night, having never rehearsed with the band before. He stayed for the next few gigs, but was considered to be too laid back and middle class to join permanently. By July, he'd been replaced by Steve Brotherdale, who also played in a group called Panic and was unwilling to commit to Warsaw full-time. Nevertheless, he did play on their first demo session, recorded at Oldham's Pennine Sound Studios on July the 18th, 1977. 5 songs were hastily committed to tape: Inside the Line, At a Later Date, Guts, The Kill, and You're No Good For Me. Raw, rushed and undeveloped, the songs sound like the typical nosebleed anthems of the time, with Ian singing rent-a-punk lyrics in a deliberately thuggish voice. The band quickly outgrew such inauspicious beginnings, although The Kill remained in the set long enough to be re-recorded with Martin Hannett during the Unknown Pleasures sessions, eventually turning up on the Still album. By the summer of 1977, the national music press was beginning to look to Manchester as a regional epicentre of the continuing punk explosion. Warsaw had received brief mentions in Sounds and NME after their first gig, and in July Paul Morley included Warsaw in an NME roundup of the Manchester scene. Morley was a young Manchester music fan and budding writer and journalist who had followed Warsaw from the beginning, and who would go on to become their greatest champion in the press, responsible in a large part for the image and the mythology that grew up around them. Warsaw returned to the Electric Circus for what was supposed to be its final weekend, over the 2nd and 3rd of October 1977. They were originally booked to play on the Saturday night of the two-day punk festival, but that night's headliners, the Drones, wouldn't even let them into the building. Richard Boone said that they could play on the Sunday, supporting the Buzzcocks once again, but then changed his mind. Ian raged at him until he let them go on. The entire weekend was recorded by Virgin Records, and Warsaw appeared alongside The Fall, the Buzzcocks and others on the Short Circuit compilation album the following summer. The Warsaw track used was At a Later Date, quite appropriate since the song showcased a band not yet fully formed and whose potential had yet to be realised. It was obvious that Steve Brotherdale wasn't right for Warsaw, and Ian placed an ad in Jones's music store in Macclesfield for a drummer. The sole reply came from Steve Morris, who'd been in the year below Ian at school until he was expelled for being found high on cough medicine. Born on the 28th of October 1957, Steve worked alongside his jazz-loving father as a kitchen fitter and, according to legend, bought his first drum kit after chopping up all the furniture in his house to sell as firewood. The band arranged to meet him for the first time outside of Manchester's Strangeways prison. His first thought on seeing them was that maybe they'd only just been let out. With their new drummer on board, Warsaw returned to Pennine Sound in December to record 4 more tracks: Warsaw, No Love Lost, Leaders of Men and Failures. Though still very much punk-influenced and dominated by Bernard's thrashing guitar, the archetypal Joy Division sound was beginning to emerge in the spaces between the noise. The 4 songs were self-released by the band as the Ideal for Living EP in June 1978 on their own Enigma label, but by that time Warsaw were long gone. At the end of 1977, having become aware of a much-hyped London band called Warsaw Pact, the Manchester Warsaw changed their name to Joy Division. This phrase was taken from one of Ian's beloved World War II pulp novels, House of Dolls by Friedrich Müller. In the Nazi concentration camps, it was the designation given to those female prisoners kept for the sexual gratification of the officers. They may have taken it as a metaphor for the condition of being in a modern rock band, or they may have just liked the sound. But either way, it was to cause a great deal of controversy. Ian's wife Deborah was disgusted that they seemed to be glorifying the degradation of women. Others accused them of displaying fascist affiliations. As Warsaw, they had dressed in black leather on stage, but gradually their image shifted towards a dour, vaguely militaristic look. Bernard, in particular, often seemed to resemble the image of a typical Hitler Youth member, banging a drum on the Ideal for Living sleeve, and even adopting the Germanic-sounding stage name Olbrecht. Joy Division's almost totalitarian-sounding music and Ian's ambiguous lyrics of blood and destruction, Wagnerian mysticism, ritual torture and a violent sacrificial sense of destiny ensured that the neo-Nazi reputation stuck with them, no matter how many rock against racism gigs they played. During the late 70s, with the far-right National Front on the rise, there were well-founded fears that punk's fashionable nihilism could be co-opted to more sinister ends. Joy Division may have justified their behaviour by saying that they were simply breaking taboos and thrusting into the open dark areas of our collective psyche that society preferred to sweep under the carpet, but many felt that they were playing an all-too-dangerous game. 1,000 copies of An Ideal for Living were pressed on 7-inch vinyl, and as Joy Division's live following grew, RCA Records paid for them to record an album's worth of demos at Arrow Studios in April 1978. Around the same time, they played alongside almost every unsigned Manchester group at a Battle of the Bands contest organised by the London indie labels Stiff and Chiswick at Rafters nightclub. There was so much competition that Joy Division had to fight to play at all, going on finally at 2 in the morning and managing 3 numbers to a near-empty bar before the plug was pulled. Tony Wilson remembers the night well. He later said that every other band was performing because they wanted to be rock stars, whereas Joy Division were obviously on the stage because they had to be. That was also the night that Tony received a torrent of verbal abuse from Ian Curtis because he had so far failed to put the band on television. He had been presenting a groundbreaking regional music show called So It Goes on Granada, which had featured the Sex Pistols, The Clash and Iggy Pop, alongside other local bands like the Buzzcocks and The Fall. So It Goes had been discontinued, but after seeing Joy Division's performance, Tony was determined to rectify his oversight and arrange for the band to run through shadow play during his What's On slot on the nightly Granada reports. With black and white footage of grim, deserted city streets projected over the band, the clip was a classic piece of music television and won the band many new fans across the region. Even those who'd seen them as Warsaw and dismissed them as just another punk band now realised that Joy Division were a more exciting proposition altogether.